Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today on this Christmas Day we will speak with James Carroll, the author of many books about religion, politics and history. His memoir of the Vietnam War, An American Requiem, won the National Book Award. His history of the Pentagon, House of War, the Pentagon and the Disastrous Rise of American Power, won the Penn Galbraith Award. And his history of Christian anti-Semitism, Constantine's Sword, the Church and the Jews, won the National Jewish Book Award. He published a weekly op-ed column in the Boston Globe for 23 years, and most recently his essay about Gaza, Secret Sharers, Jews and Muslim, and This Long Cruel War appeared in the American Prospect. A former Catholic priest, he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we will discuss the meaning of Christmas in spite of Vance saying, quote, "By the grace of God, we will always be a Christian nation," and the heresy of the prosperity gospel. Then we'll continue our retrospective of 2025 from the Background Briefing archives and go to an interview from April the 14th of 2025 when we spoke with Stephen Simon, a visiting professor and distinguished fellow at Dartmouth College who served on the National Security Council staff as Senior Director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs from 2011 to 2012. He also worked on the NSC staff on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. Currently, he is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and was formerly a fellow in international affairs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's the co-author, among other books, of The Age of Sacred Terror, and his latest book is Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And he had an article at the New York Times where we discussed the U.S. must now reckon with a hegemon in the Middle East, Israel. Then we go to an interview from June the 9th of 2025 with Barbara Walter, the Raw Professor of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and one of the world's leading experts on civil wars, violent extremism, and domestic terror. The author of 5 books. Her latest is the New York Times bestseller, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. She joined us to assess Trump's two-pronged strategies of scaring off protests against him and instigating provocations to justify a fascist takeover. And before we begin, as this year ends and you can make tax-deductible donations for 2025, I'm hoping you consider backgroundbriefing.org/donate and publictruthmedia.org for your charitable giving, since we produce a daily news analysis program covering the major stories in the news 5 days a week on a very modest budget, and have recently expanded our production team from 2 people, that's me and Graham, to 5 employees as we expand our social media presence and have a new Gen Z reporter to engage the future generation in a coalition of boomers and zoomers out to make America decent and sane again, and the world a better place for all. So happy holidays to you, and the very best in the new year as we expand our fact-based community in post-truth America. And on this Christmas Day, we're joined by James Carroll, the author of many books about religion, politics, and history. His memoir of the Vietnam War, An American Requiem, won the National Book Award. His history of the Pentagon, House of War, the Pentagon and the Disastrous Rise of American Power, won the Penn Galbraith Award. And his history of Christian anti-Semitism, Constantine's Sword, the Church and the Jews, won the National Jewish Book Award. He published a weekly op-ed column in the Boston Globe for 23 years, and most recently his essay about Gaza, Secret Sharers, Jews, Muslims, and This Long Cruel War appeared in the American Prospect. A former Catholic priest, he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Welcome to Background Briefing, James Carroll.
Thank you, Ian. It's a great pleasure to be with you again.
Well, thanks for joining us on this holiday. Unfortunately, the Holy Land is not a very pleasant place to be in, not that it was necessarily for the prophet Jesus, who of course ended up being crucified by the Romans. But I wanted to start out on this Christmas Day because recently J.D. Vance made a speech at Turning Point USA in which he said, for example, told the audience that they should no longer have to apologize for being white, which is an extraordinary statement. I didn't realize that that kind of statement was necessary. And then secondly, he received the loudest applause from the crowd when he told them that, quote, by the grace of God, we will always be a Christian nation. So this Christian chauvinism is unfortunately pretty prominent in this administration, and you've got this Fox News talking head who's the Secretary of Defense, who has Crusader tattoos on his body, etc. So what's your sense of this disconnect between the New Testament and this kind of Christian chauvinism? Because I always thought that Christianity and the prophet Jesus was all about humility, not aggressive nationalism.
Well, you've put your finger on it, Ian, and I'm glad to start with you on the point you raise. The most striking thing to me about Vance and Hegseth and company, of course, presided over by Donald Trump, is how blatant they are about affirming what in the long tradition of the United States have been identified as villainous, wicked, anti-democratic characteristics. What we're seeing is the assertion of a regime of white supremacist Christianity. White Christian agendas inform the new regime. And Vance and Hegseth are blatant about it, Ian. That's what's amazing to me. We've had a long tradition of white racism struggling to dominate the culture of the United States. But at least across the last generation, they've been careful to sort of disguise their agenda behind other political and social claims. But to have these spokespeople of the MAGA movement identify a Christian nation and a white nation as essential goals of the movement is astonishing to me. You're, of course, exactly right to suggest that this agenda is a complete contradiction of the values found in not only in the story of Jesus, but in the biblical narrative itself, which is a long affirmation, beginning with the book of Genesis, that because God is the father of all human beings, there is to be equality, mutual respect as notes of humans one to another. The idea of human respect across boundaries of politics, gender, religion is a biblical idea, and it is wonderfully celebrated with the Christmas story. This political agenda that is threatening the democracy that we've all taken for granted all these years couldn't be more opposed to the values that Christians around the world, at least nominally, celebrate with this beautiful, simple Christmas story.
Well, so many of these Christians on the right have this notion of being beleaguered, being oppressed, and they sort of tie into the New Testament notion of sacrifice in the terms of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. I mean, Russ Limbaugh's brother wrote a book about how oppressed Christians are in this country. So when Vance talks about we no longer have to apologize about being white, it seems to be based upon this idea that somehow Christians are a beleaguered minority in this country, which is an absurd notion.
Well, especially this week, this day, when we remember the really elegant story of the mother and the father and the newborn child living in a stable. Why are they in a stable? Because they're asylum seekers, they're refugees, they're homeless people. The man and the woman are gender nonconforming, if that's one way to think of the tradition that thinks of Mary as a virgin. and who are being targeted above all by the present regime, for which Vance and Hegseth are proud spokespeople. Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus could well be rounded up by ICE if they were alive in America right now. The thought that white people of all categories are being oppressed right now is ludicrous. When was the last time you saw photographs of Northern European white people being rounded up by the fascist thugs of ICE? It's not happening. ICE is going after people of color. How dare Vance suggest that white people are the oppressed? It's very, very clear who the oppressed are at our moment, and not just within the boundaries or the borders of the United States. The oppression that this regime is inflicting on people all over the planet is astonishing and shameful also. That should be part of what's lifted up in this season.
Right, and at the turning point gathering recently, Vance told the largely white audience that they should join ICE. So that is their priority. They're throwing money at ICE. They're throwing money at the Pentagon. Trump just talked about building the Trump class of battleships. Truly absurd and a monumental waste of money, just at a time when military technology indicates that cheap drones and missiles can take out battleships at will. I mean, it's unbelievable what's going on. And I know your father was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency during the Vietnam War, and you rebelled against that war. So you have direct personal experience of somebody that takes on the Pentagon.
Well, it's very clear, isn't it, that Trump piles one stupidity on top of another. The language fails to do justice to what's been happening. And this notion of commissioning a new class of battleships is the stupidest idea he's come up with, well, lately anyway. As you indicate, battleships, huge, monolithic vessels with thousands, no doubt, thousands of members of the crew are sitting ducks in the world we live in now. Aircraft carriers are already sitting ducks. A simple drone armed with a powerful set of explosives could damage an aircraft carrier to the point of sinking it, bringing down 2,000 to 3,000 American sailors all in one fell swoop. What would that do to the American psyche? And a battleship would be just the only thing to be hopeful about with the battleship, unlike, for example, the new Versailles-like ballroom Trump is building. The hope about the battleship is it's such a wildly stupid idea that it's almost inconceivable that it would be carried out.
Right, but the vanity of him calling it the Trump
Yes, of
class
course. Well,
is there, and you got the same vanity of building this hideous ballroom, which is if it's finished, and I pray to God it is never constructed. I don't know who and how it can be stopped, but it will be an enduring insult to posterity to have the entire White House distorted by this massive white elephant. That the architect tried to argue with Trump to reduce the thing down to scale so it wasn't such an eyesore, but he was fired.
What are we seeing here, Ian? Let's go back to the Christmas story. Don't forget that Jesus and Mary traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem because an emperor ordered a census of all the people living in the empire, and they had to register with the government in the hometown of the family name, which in Joseph's case was Bethlehem. So Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem, the arduous journey that no doubt put that late-term pregnant woman at risk. What was going on there? This was an activity constructed for the vanity of the emperor. The emperor's vanity is what was driving the Christmas story. What are we living through in the United States of America today? An emperor's vanity. That's what's really alarming about because there is no rational project behind almost any of the activities that the Trump administration is carrying out. You mentioned the ballroom. I mean, the vanity of the man to slap his name on the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, which is named not just in honor of Kennedy. That building, that Performing Arts Center, is a memorial to the assassinated president. There is no memorial to John F. Kennedy in Washington except that Performing Arts Center. And Trump has blasphemed that memorial by slapping his name on it. And of course, he's too dull to even know that that's what he's done. He wants to build a triumphal arch at the entrance to the Arlington Cemetery. My God, how to desecrate the sacred ground in which America's heroes are buried. A triumphal arch to Donald Trump at that sacred space. It goes on, Ian. We must find language, we Americans, for describing the beyond language categories of insult, incompetence, corruption that are unfolding every single day. The news is an endless succession of Trump's vain, ignorant, self-obsessed insults to the American tradition, to American democracy, to the world we're all trying to live in and preserve for our children quite desperately.
Well, you have to add the word cruelty too, because
Oh, indeed
just
so.
just before Christmas, Trump announced that the Department of Education is going to start garnering wages of kids who defaulted on their student loans. And a lot of these student loans come from these predatory for-profit colleges that are a total rip-off, entirely financed by the taxpayer. They're just an obscenity, the worst kind of bottom-feeding, crooked institutions, the worst of Washington, is represented in those for-profit colleges. They get these young kids from the military and also those aspiring to join the middle class and end up getting them in a lifetime of debt and a worthless diploma. And that is what Trump not only is encouraging these crooks by giving them a green light, he's now punishing the victims.
Yes, and of course, you're absolutely right. Cruelty is the point, as a reporter said during his first term. Let me just shift slightly to say we've done a good job of offering the litany of insults and let's call them what they are, crimes that are being committed under the Trump administration. What are we going to do about it? That's the biggest question. And we American citizens must find ways of being together in solidarity, organizing whenever we can, however we can, to stand against what Donald Trump represents. Obviously, that means focusing on down-to-earth political activity, making sure that we have a robust turnout for the midterm elections next year. But it also means getting together, sharing with each other our experiences of this period, and looking for ways that we can stand against it. The danger is that we'll be so discouraged, so full of despair about what's unfolding, that we'll slip back into a kind of inert resignation. And that is precisely what Trump and his company are counting on. We must continue to find ways to stand up against this madness, this cruelty, this illegality. And people are doing it all over the country. We can see it happening a lot. I'm a member of something called Writers for Democratic Action, which is an organization of about 4,000 writers across the country. We're doing what we can do. The No Kings movement is strong, laying the groundwork for the next nationwide No Kings demonstration. We don't have kings. This is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. this is the moment to seize, to make sure that we don't have this dictatorship succeed in destroying what that revolution set in motion, an imperfect but nevertheless promising ideal of democratic liberalism. We must fight to defend it, to make it survive. We must continually find ways to say no to Donald Trump and his regime.
Well, James Carroll, I thank you so much for joining us on this Christmas Day.
Merry Christmas to you, Ian, and to all of your listeners. It's a privilege to be listening with you and talking with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James. And again, James Carroll is the author of many books about religion, politics, and history. His memoir of the Vietnam War, An American Requiem, won the National Book Award. His History of the Pentagon, House of War, the Pentagon, and the Disastrous Rise of American Power won the Penn Galbraith Award. And his History of Christian Anti-Semitism, Constantine's Sword, the Church, and the Jews won the National Jewish Book Award. He published a weekly op-ed column in the Boston Globe for 23 years, and most recently his essays about Gaza, secret sharers, Jews, Muslims, and this long cruel war appeared in the American Prospect. And he's a former Catholic priest and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back in a moment with an interview from April the 14th of 2025 with Steve Simon.
If we make it through December, everything's gonna be all right, I know. It's the coldest time of winter, and I shiver when I see the falling snow.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Stephen Simon, who is a visiting professor and a distinguished fellow at Dartmouth College, who served on the National Security Council staff as senior fellow for Middle Eastern and North African affairs from 2011 to 2012. He also worked on the NSC staff on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. And currently he's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and was formerly a fellow in international affairs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's the co-author, among other books, of The Age of Sacred Terror, and his latest book is Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And he has an article at the New York Times, The U.S. Must Now Reckon with a Hegemon in the Middle East, Israel. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephen Simon.
Great to be back, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And last week's Oval Office meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, was that a kind of a good cop, bad cop routine, in as much as the next day Trump announced that there would be talks between Iran and the United States in Oman, which happened on Saturday? So is he using Netanyahu's I don't know what to say, his intentions, his wish, his dream to bomb the hell out of Iran's nuclear facilities? Is that in Trump's back pocket?
Well, there's no question that Netanyahu sees, the way out of the dilemma posed by Iran's nuclear program as military action. I mean, that's the magic bullet, as it were, for Netanyahu. But Trump has been saying for months that he was open to negotiations with Iran. He hasn't made any secret of that. He's a deal maker, and he wants to do a deal with Iran. The terms on which such a deal might be constructed are, maybe are not so easy to discern, but nevertheless, that's what he's been saying. He has deployed a very large military force to the region that looks like exactly the sort of force you'd assemble if you were going to attack Iran and disarm it using military force. He's got about a quarter of our B-2 strategic bombers forward deployed in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, I think at least two, possibly three carrier aviation battle groups, aircraft carriers and everything that comes with them in the region. So, he it looks like he's been preparing to use military force, but I think, the administration probably views that as a useful source of pressure and inducement, I guess, to Iran's playing ball in the negotiations, because Iran could look at the hammer out there and wonder what will happen if they don't come to yes, if they don't get to yes with Donald Trump. But I think Trump's first impulse and what he really wants is a deal that he can brag about with Iran. And if he gets it, well, more power to him.
There were also rumors or leaks that these nuclear-capable B-2 bombers, they maybe have some tactical nukes aboard. So they certainly got Iran's attention. And what was your readout from the meeting on Saturday? Do we know anything more than that they're going to have another meeting?
No, all we know is, all that the public knows at this stage is that there will be another meeting. So it didn't blow up in Oman. It wasn't, the talks were not direct, so there wasn't that, I think, that potential for interpersonal conflict in any way. But Khamenei has been, that is to say, the ruler of Iran, has been more and more forward-leaning in recent weeks. He delivered an edict just a couple of days ago, authorizing, or rather, removing any prohibition on American investment in Iran. And I think this was a direct play for what they perceive to be dear to Trump's heart, which is, getting money and sinking it into things and building hotels and stuff like that. So it's pretty clear that the Iranians want to square something away with this administration. They don't want to be struck militarily. They want to get out from under sanctions. And right now they're under a lot of pressure from Israel. So, I think from their perspective, from Iran's perspective, the best outcome now would be a deal of some sort if they could somehow reconcile their current progress, that is to say, Iran's current progress in building up a stockpile of fissile material, and what the Trump administration is likely to ask for. I don't know how that'll play out, and the two sides will have to figure that out. But right now, I haven't in recent years seen conditions lining up so favorably for talks.
Yeah, and a Tehran Trump Tower has a certain ring to it, Stephen. But let's talk about your article with Aaron David Miller at the New York Times. The U.S. must now reckon with a hegemon in the Middle East, Israel. And you point out that essentially Gaza is lost. There's no way. The worst is going to happen there, I take it. I'm just sort of condensing what you've written. There is some hope in Lebanon. And as far as Syria is concerned, Israel would prefer to see a weakened and divided Syria as opposed to having the U.S. and the rest of the world, stabilize that new government. And then, of course, we're talking about Iran as well. So let's go through them step by step. How do you see Gaza, and particularly in the context of how Netanyahu is ramping up pressure, not just on Gaza, where he's literally invading with a land invasion, but also on the West Bank?
Well, first of all, in Gaza, the Israeli army has grabbed a lot of territory now for its own use, as kind of a buffer against whatever is going on in Gaza and the border with Israel. So the actual physical geographical area of Gaza is shrinking. And the second thing is that the Israelis have now taken, fully half of southern Gaza up to the Egyptian border and the Philadelphia corridor that runs between Egypt and Israel over there. So they're chewing that place up, pretty badly, and the Netanyahu government has not been willing to consider any arrangements that might enable the fighting to stop and reconstruction to begin. That's about it. On the West Bank, it's this right wing, this religious right government really cares about the West Bank. They want it. And they're going to do whatever they can within their own system, within the Israeli system, to push the government to back efforts to annex the West Bank. And if not all of the West Bank, then a lot more of it than is currently in Israel's possession under the Oslo Accords of 1993. So, watch this space, but it's not good.
Well, Netanyahu clearly has divided Israel, and it seems almost irreconcilable. But does the division favor the right? In other words, are there more right-wing nationalists and religious nationalists in Israel than there are more secular, progressive Israelis?
I think that the country is fairly evenly divided between the religious right generally, and the religious right is composed of two halves. The one are the folks that we've just been talking about, and the other is what they call the religious nationalist right. And those those two halves of the right wing in Israel, they might not agree on everything, but they agree on a lot. And the nationalist right, I think, would be happy if the religious right won its war to annex all of the West Bank, because for these folks, it's a religious issue. It's not a strategic issue. It's not a military balance issue. It's not, a security issue. It's a religious issue that, for Israel to be validated in the eyes of God, then Israel needs to control the lands. The Jews need to be settling the lands that were given to the Israelites by God, as the Bible reports, the Old Testament reports. So, for them, this is really important, and it's a lot more important than sort of everyday, mundane international politics.
So what about Lebanon in terms of your guarded optimism?
Well, um, uh, relatively speaking, Lebanon is looking okay. In the wake of the disaster that the Israelis visited on Hezbollah, the reigning Iran-backed Shiite party in Lebanon, the Lebanese have finally formed a government after a really long time, and it's a technocratic government. And the government has pledged, as part of its responsibilities, to carry out Lebanon's obligations under the UN Security Council resolution that ended the 2006 Lebanon war. And that means boosting the Lebanese army and getting it down south to southern Lebanon so that it can crowd out Hezbollah and relieve Israeli security fears of further Hezbollah attacks from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. So this is a major gain, and Hezbollah has been weakened. So its stranglehold on Lebanese politics has likewise been weakened. And this is promising, I think, for Lebanon's political future, and it lays the groundwork for some ultimate reconciliation between Lebanon and Israel, political reconciliation between Lebanon and Israel that might, uh, involve agreed upon borders and things like that have eluded those two countries for decades. So I'm guardedly optimistic, as you put it. Yes, I am on Lebanon. Syria is a bit of a different issue, because as you pointed out, the Israelis want a weak and divided Syria, and it's in the United States' interest to have a centralized Syria. a centralized government. It could be more stable. It can deliver on agreements. You've got somebody you can pick up the phone and talk to. All in all, it's kind of a better thing. It's the premise for more, investment, and that country desperately needs a mix of private and public funding, and investment to repair the damage from the long-lasting civil war. So the U.S. and Israel have somewhat different objectives, it seems to me, or different interests in Syria, and somehow those interests have got to be reconciled. My co-author and I were very concerned because what Israel is very good at doing is military stuff. They're really good at doing it, but they're not very good at converting those military gains into durable diplomatic gains. And at some point, the gains made by purely military means are gonna fade. They're gonna break up. They'll shatter. And when that happens, a great deal of violence is going to be unleashed. So my co-author and I, Aaron David Miller, and myself, wanted to urge the Trump administration to urge the Israelis to take advantage of their military gains to forge diplomatic victories that meet everyone's interest. There's something in it for everybody, and they'll therefore be more long-lasting and better for Israel.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Stephen, let's talk about the U.S. must now reckon with the hegemon in the Middle East, Israel. The other possible hegemon, of course, is Turkey, and we know that Erdogan has a massive ego and is a kleptocrat and an autocrat. And his people are demonstrating against him, but he's cracking heads. Last time we spoke, you suggested that there might well be a clash between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Turkey in the future. I guess the ties behind the scenes are that Israel gets about 60% of its oil from Azerbaijan, which Erdogan and his cronies take a cut from as it comes through the Bosphorus. So he's taking money from Israel, on the side, but publicly excoriating Israel. So where do you think that's heading?
Well, among the more interesting developments of the past couple of weeks has been a report of back-channel talks between Israel and Turkey about over an agreement to divide Syria into respective spheres of influence. So, according to these reports, the Israelis and Turks have recognized the danger of confrontation within the Syrian space between Israeli and Turkish forces, and they both understand that the risks to them, to both of them, will be quite grave if that were to happen. So they've gotten together in this back-channel way to divide notional lines between their respective spheres of influence in Syria in the hope of avoiding a clash. So that's good on the one hand, because it lowers the risk of conflict between Israel and Turkey, which would be a real terrible thing from a perspective of U.S. interests, because the last thing you want is to have two of your allies going at each other. On the other hand, it locks in this separation of Syria into little statelets, the cantonization of Syria, which will make it extremely difficult for the government ever to deliver on stabilization and reconstruction for the entire country. So in that respect, it's a very adverse development.
Well, Stephen Simon, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
The pleasure was all mine, Ian.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And again, I've been speaking with Stephen Simon, who's a visiting professor and distinguished fellow at Dartmouth College, who served on the National Security Council staff as a senior director for Middle Eastern and North African affairs, and also worked on the NSC staff on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. Currently, he is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and was formerly a fellow in international affairs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is also the co-author, among other books, of Sacred Terror And his latest book is Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And he has an article at the New York Times, The U.S. Must Now Reckon with a Hegemon in the Middle East, Israel. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an interview from June the 9th of 2025 with Barbara Walter. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Barbara Walter, the Raw Professor of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and one of the world's leading experts on civil wars, violent extremism, and domestic terror. The author of 5 books. Her latest book is the New York Times bestseller, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. Welcome to Background Briefing, Barbara Walter.
Thank you, Ian. It's great to be back.
Well, thanks for joining us. And a lot of commentators, and particularly people that on the political left, for what it is, I guess, the Democratic Party, are seeing what's happening in Los Angeles as, and then this, of course, is reflected by the governor himself, along with the mayor of Los Angeles, that Trump is deliberately trying to stoke some kind of a civil war or an insurrection and use martial law or invoke martial law as an excuse. Our previous guest on today's program, Barbara, John Lawrence, who was Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff for 8 years and a 38-year veteran of the House of Representatives, has a piece that we discussed at Trump's Reichstag moment. How would you describe this moment?
Trump is pursuing really 2 classic strategies that are not a surprise for anybody who studies sort of aspiring autocrats. The first strategy is a deterrence strategy, and Trump has admitted to this. He said one of his goals is to deter other protesters in other blue states from going into the streets, because if he wants to hold on to power, one of the most effective ways of pushing him out of the White House is for Americans to go to the street and start consistent, broad-ranged protests. So he's using the LA protests as a very early opportunity for him to signal to other citizens in blue states that they're going to be punished for this. But there's a second strategy that he's pursuing that he's not talking about, and it's called a provocation strategy. And the provocation strategy is really designed to provoke violence, to provoke actions that he can then use to say to his supporters or to say to people in swing states who are on the fence about what they think about Trump right now, to provide hard evidence that what Trump is telling them, that blue states are chaotic, that they're lawless, that they support illegal immigrants over law-abiding Americans, is true. And wannabe autocrats do this in a variety of ways. One, they go and do what Trump is doing, which is they have they send in the military or the National Guard, and their response is harsh. And that harsh response is trying to provoke a more violent response, which of course they'll capture on video, and which of course that they'll use to tell people that Trump is justified. The other thing that they do, and we haven't seen this yet, but we suspect that Trump did this in Portland back in his first term, is you plant what political scientists call violence entrepreneurs within the protests. And these are individuals who they've been tasked with going around and rioting, going around and breaking windows and looting stores. And then this is captured on video and used as hard evidence. So the deterrence strategy is something Trump's upfront about. He's like, I don't want other protesters to go on the streets. We're going to nip this in the bud. The provocation strategy is more, it's potentially more dangerous because it's designed to escalate protests into violent confrontations. And that's when Trump can then say, ha, I'm justified in declaring martial law. I'm justified in cracking down. And oftentimes citizens will support this because they believe, in fact, that what he's telling them is true.
So far then, Barbara, people in the red states have been who watch Fox News, they're getting exactly what you just
Yeah.
suggested, right? They're getting the optics, the visuals that reinforce what Trump is saying on Truth Social, that there's a migrant invasion.
Yes. But there's also a risk here for Trump. So this is not, a net positive necessarily for Trump. He's taking a risk and he might not actually even be aware of it. If you go back to the civil rights movement and you study the strategy that Martin Luther King and leaders of that movement pursued, it was a brilliant strategy. And it was a strategy that emphasized peace, 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 peace. Go back to Gandhi, go back to Nelson Mandela. They all follow this playbook, and it's a very effective playbook. And what they're doing is they're countering that provocation strategy. They're basically saying, you can shoot rubber bullets at us. You can shoot real bullets at us. You can fire hose us. You can do all sorts of really terribly nasty things to us. And we will not fight back. And why that tends to be really, really effective is that if you get it on video, which of course is going to happen in 2025, what it proves is that, in fact, the protesters are not the bad guy, but that the government or whoever is leading the charge on the government side is actually the bad force. And it provides the counter evidence that, in fact, what Trump is saying is not true, that the people out in the street are not illegal immigrants, and they're not terrible criminals and rapists and whatever else Trump wants to say, but that they're in fact moms and teenage kids and shopkeepers and average citizens, and they're not fighting it back. In fact, they're holding up peace signs, or they're holding up daisies, or they're doing something else that unequivocally proves that in fact they are not the ones who are inciting violence. And if your show, for example, a wall of moms who are being pushed back or beaten or thrown on the street by men who are in essentially military attire, then it's hard for people in important swing states or people who are on the fence about Trump to believe that in fact he has that he is in the right. So Trump is taking a risk here. And we now know what works and what doesn't work. And I suspect that the LA protesters are going to try their hardest to make clear that in fact that they are orderly and peaceful and simply exercising their right to speak out.
So are you saying then, Barbara, that we need another Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela?
I mean, I think everybody could use a Nelson Mandela and a Martin Luther King. But yes, I mean, I think, when you have somebody like Trump in power, and and we've seen this throughout history, you need a powerful individual with a powerful message and a peaceful message to counter that. And right now, the United States doesn't have that person, but I actually am a firm believer in the talent that we have here in the United States, of the quality of citizens we have in the United States, and I think somebody will emerge, but whoever does emerge, what will be successful is a strategy of peace. And in fact, the FBI after Waco and after Ruby Ridge, these disastrous confrontations between American citizens who were holed up in these places and the FBI. What the FBI learned from that is meeting that sort of protest with violence can really backfire. And it can backfire by radicalizing your opponents even further, and by turning average citizens against you. And so the FBI shifted to a strategy, and you can think of that strategy called, I think they actually call it this, infinite patience. Infinite patience. And that is that when they're confronting a situation, a hostile situation like that, you don't go in guns blazing. You go in with patience and you wait them out. And the cameras are rolling, and the rest of America can see that, in fact, you are being reasonable and moderate, and you are you're not taking extreme measures. And I think protest movements that do the same thing. They show infinite patience in the face of what could be brutality or repression or policies that harm their communities immensely. Infinite patience while you're out in the street and you are voicing your dissatisfaction with this. That ultimately wins out in the end.
And Barbara, today's FBI, Trump's FBI, is run by Kash Patel,
Yeah.
who is an obsessed fanboy of Trump's and will do anything
Yes.
Trump tells him. And his deputy is even more on the lunatic fringe, Dan Bongino, who's a far right-wing blogger. I wouldn't expect anything but escalation of violence from those two.
So the fastest way to radicalize a population that right now might be staying at home, might be keeping their heads down, going to work, going back their everyday business, hoping that things will calm down or get better. The fastest way to radicalize that population is to go after innocent civilians with excessive force. So we now have the head of the FBI who is not he's not a particularly competent person. He really probably doesn't understand how the FBI works, and he almost certainly is not. He hasn't been trained in the methods of the FBI in these situations. What works, what doesn't work. If his natural inclination is to go in with excessive force, it will backfire and it will have the opposite effect. And if you're someone like Trump, the last thing you want to do is radicalize a majority of Americans really, really quickly. So I really don't know how Kash Patel is going to react because he's such an unknown. And he's grossly underqualified for this job. But I can tell you that historically, if you react to protests like this, peaceful protests with excessive force, it doesn't end well for you.
And in terms of what Trump has invoked in his latest order, there seems to be a bigger problem in this order than just deploying and federalizing the National Guard forces here in Los Angeles. In fact, Trump's memorandum doesn't even mention Los Angeles. It authorizes deployment, quote, at locations where protests against ICE functions are occurring or are likely to occur. So while the Insurrection Act authorizes deployment of active duty armed forces under 10 U.S.C. 12406, it only authorizes the federalization of the Guard. Any use of active duty troops to enforce the law under this memorandum would thus be a clear violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. So 2 points there. One is that this is a national order that Trump is giving right across the country. It's not just about LA. And two, are we bumping up against the Posse Comitatus Act?
Well, the Posse Comitatus Act is absolutely not called for in this situation. So that could potentially create a constitutional crisis. The fact that Trump is issuing what seems to be a national order, again, that gets back to his deterrence strategy. Probably the fastest way that Trump could be thrown out of the White House prior to the next election would be if there were mass sustained protests across the United States. And on some level, whether it's conscious or unconscious, he understands this. And so he wants to send a signal to all the major cities around the country that, that he's going to send the National Guard there if there are protests, just like he's doing in Los Angeles today. But the reality is this is a really, really big country geographically. It's spread out. It's a very populated country with, a lot of highly skilled, motivated, armed Americans. And if he had major sustained protests in every major and mid-sized city in the United States, the National Guard couldn't handle that. He would, in some respects, be facing being thrown out of office pretty quickly. And he understands that. So this is his attempt to signal to citizens around the country, don't protest. But boy, if they coordinated and we had mass protests across all the major cities in the United States simultaneously, there's nothing the National Guard could do about that.
Well, back on January the 21st of 2017, the day after Trump's inauguration, there was a massive spontaneous demonstration across this country and around the world of largely women who just showed up. And I don't know to this day who organized it, and I'm not sure anybody did, but it happened spontaneously. Is that something that could be repeated?
Oh, well, if it happened in the past, in the recent past, it could happen again. And social media actually makes it quite easy to organize these types of protests. The question is can you sustain them? But let's put that aside. And let's talk a little bit about North Africa and the Arab Spring. Prior to the 2011 protests across North Africa and the Middle East, the most authoritarian countries in the world, governments in the world, were in those two regions. And you had dictators in places like Tunisia and Egypt and Syria who had been in power, many of them for decades. And nobody thought they would ever leave power, and certainly not because their citizens went into the streets. And of course, when the citizens went into the streets, it actually took just a matter of weeks for people like Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt to flee. And what ultimately did them in, and Mubarak is the best example of this, is he sent the military out into the streets to shoot at Egyptian civilians. And the military said no. So take those examples where you have entrenched authoritarianism, where you have the military in much closer alignment with the dictators, and now go to the United States and think about what would happen if we had protests in the United States and the National Guard wasn't enough. And Trump said, okay, I'm commander in chief of the military, I'm sending in the military. And now let's add, what if the protests are mainly women? Millions and millions of women, moms for peace, however you want to think about it. Do you think the military is going to shoot at these protesters to save Trump? My guess is absolutely not. They didn't do it to save Mubarak, and he was essentially paying them. I don't see that happening here in the United States. Not that there wouldn't be some violence, not that there aren't some individuals in the military who might follow those orders, but I don't see the leadership of the military going in and doing what Mubarak was hoping they would do in Egypt.
Right. And just in closing, of course, a lot of the military are minorities, particularly Latinos,
Yes.
who are the very
Yes.
people that are getting beaten up.
Exactly.
And even though Hegseth wants to remake the military into an all-white, non-female, non-minority organization. So I thank you for joining us, Barbara. I appreciate your insight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Barbara Walter, who's the Royal Professor of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and one of the world's leading experts on civil wars, violent extremism, and domestic terror. She's the author of 5 books. Her latest is the New York Times bestseller, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out in the